Everybody, thanks so much for listening. If you're listening to us for the first time, please subscribe. It's at the bottom of the screen on YouTube. Again, please subscribe. We're trying to get this interview out to as many people as possible. We're going to be talking about the 2000 election. I know people say, oh, that was, 22 years ago. Who cares about that? That's old hat. It's not. It's actually these issues that went on in 2000. First of all, they changed history to what it is now, because we had two wars due to this president. And obviously the 9/11 attacks, who knows what would have happened with a different president. I'm not going to go in deep into the weeds on that, but this issue did change what happened in history and we are also seeing the issues that went on into the voter issue still go on now. So this is extremely important, and we have to learn from our history. Otherwise, we will repeat history. It's common knowledge and common sense. We have Voltaire Sancho on. He was, for 28 years, from 89 to 2017, the supervisor of elections of Leon County. For people that don't know Florida politics much, this is up in the Tallahassee area as far as that goes. Ion, thanks so much for coming on and doing this informative interview. It's really important, and I appreciate you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Let me just say that this opens up old wounds.
Yeah.
The 2000 election changed me to the individual I eventually became. I never believed that I would witness what I witnessed. And it was a sad day in American history. And it is, as you've mentioned, it's a point in American history that changed us forever. And we're still unwilling to talk about it. It's as if a massive scar occurred and we wanted to cover it up as quickly as possible. And that it was shocking to me, because we know today that we know who actually won the election, and it was not George Bush. The media put a consortium together that took them 12 months to count all 67 counties. And unfortunately, what they discerned was exactly the reason why the Republican Party and the Republican establishment, not only in Florida, but nationally, mobilized to prevent Florida from conducting a recount. And that's exactly what happened. And what we know today is something that we didn't know then. We didn't know if we could accurately count the votes. The Republican embarked upon a campaign at all costs to block the state of Florida from implementing its election laws. That's what occurred. And so much garbage and misinformation and anger and division was sowed during that period that, quite frankly, we're reaping what the seeds of 2000 wrought. In fact, everything that we're seeing today was replayed in miniature in the 2000 election. Attacks on the validity of the election officials themselves, which now manifest themselves dramatically through America, where a significant portion of Republicans actually believe that American election officials stole the election in a grand conspiracy. These roots started, Rob, in 2000.
It's crazy, and I want to get into the interview, but seeing the Obamas and the Democrats hug George Bush, act like he's, Jesus Christ right now because of Donald J. Trump, and also saying Dick Cheney is a sign of democracy. These people are war criminals. And for anybody, Democrat or Republican, to praise these people, I think they're on different planets than we're living on, and they definitely are living in dream worlds. But let's get into this interview quickly, because we have interviewed a lot of people on this subject. Carol Roberts, who was on the board in Palm Beach County, Jack Young, who was he was in Miami-Dade County. I know you were over there helping out with the hand recount. I'm not sure if he was there at that time, but he was one of the Gore lawyers down in Miami-Dade County, traveled all over the state and spoke about this. For people that are listening to this, Ion, that were not born in 2000 or didn't comprehend because they were too young for the 2000 election, can you go a little backtrack and start with when you got into office in 89 and how elections were handled up to the year 2000 and how that 2000 changed everything?
Yes, Florida is a decentralized state in terms of its elections administration, and there is no uniform elections administration in the United States of America. You have 50 different election board, state election officials, and they can be local or state depending upon the state. For example, in Oklahoma, the central state apparatus controls the entire election, and election officials at the local county simply distribute the materials and collect the materials. All the voter registration and all the vote tabulation is done in central locations in Oklahoma. Florida, completely different. We have 67 individuals, local supervisor of elections, all but one, Miami-Dade, are elected officials, locally elected countywide, mostly on a partisan basis. And this actually emerged in the 2000 election as a key point, because some election officials did act in a partisan manner.
Mhm.
And what we saw was that on election night, NBC called the election for Gore. They immediately had to pull back that call, and there was massive confusion. It's the first time something like this had ever happened. And in the aftermath of that confusion, the preliminary results indicated that candidate Bush had 1,786 votes lead. Now, one of the things that people have to understand is that the preliminary count on election night has never, let me repeat this, because this emerged in 2020, has never tabulated all the votes on election night. There's many reasons for that. Primarily our vote by mail ballots, which have to be processed after the election. Because of this, Florida did change its laws. And Florida, for example, is one of the few states that provide adequate time for election officials to vote, to tabulate the vote by mail ballots. Florida election officials have 3 weeks before the election to do this process. So we can process millions of ballots and then on election night, produce the results. This was something that later on that President or ex-President Trump calculated and utilized to try to bring down the validity of the election, but that's another issue. So anyways, on election night in 2000, the preliminary numbers indicated that there was a slight lead for George Bush. The normal process is to go through the state's election laws, which in Florida's recount laws were in Chapter 102, and you simply apply the laws and go through the process. What happened was that the Republicans, both in the state of Florida and nationally, made the decision they could not afford a recount. They were deathly afraid of recounts because what happens is usually in the urban areas, they're the last votes to be tabulated. Those are African-American votes. And as we later found out, there was a plan to try to restrict African-American votes cast in the election. This was not something that was ever brought out during the actual election itself, because it was only identified months after the 2000 election was over. So immediately, the Republicans tried to block the state of Florida from utilizing its state laws to do the recount. Normally, there are ballots in a recount are two types that you must look at. Those ballots which are called undervotes, in which no vote has been recorded for a candidate. You have to hand examine those ballots to see if in fact that is true, or did the machines not accurately record the result. The other type of vote is called the overvote, where the machine records, oh, 2 votes have been cast in a race in which only 1 vote can be legally cast. And you have to, again, ascertain, did the machine correctly read those ballots.
Mhm.
What happened in the entire battle was that the Republicans gambled to block everything, blocking everything. The state of Florida never examined the overvoted ballots at all. All 50 states examined these ballots. They were never examined in the state of Florida in the election. The undervotes were started to be examined, and that's what was blocked by the US Supreme Court on a 5-4 vote. I believe it was on December 9th. I was the individual selected by the Florida Supreme Court to oversee the recount from a technical perspective. The Supreme Court ordered that the judges of the state, the most non-political, most impartial individuals, would take over the recount. And I was the technical advisor to the judges. We never completed the recount because on the Saturday after the recount started, the US Supreme Court blocked it. And so Florida becomes the only state in the history of the United States that was never allowed to complete an election. We were barred from doing that. And what we know today, looking at the data collected from the media consortium that had all the undervotes and all the overvotes been counted, candidate Gore wins the election by 171 votes. That's what we know if an accurate count had been done with the ballots. But such a count was blocked at every level by the state and National Republican Party. They gambled everything on stopping the process to win at all costs. And this element, winning at all costs, breaking the norms of American politics, is something that has now dominated the Republican Party. The political norms, which had I witnessed as I grew through all of this area from the 50s all the way through today, the political norms that led the Republican Party to recognize that President Richard Nixon had broken the law and must be removed, those political norms are gone. Today, it's win at any cost, irrespective of the candidate committing a crime. We don't care. And so all the way, if we go back, for example, if the same mentality had existed today, the Republicans would not have allowed Richard Nixon to be threatened with impeachment. But then we had political norms that basically said that honesty was a value. You had to recognize truth. Truth was a value. The term fake news did not exist. Citizens understood that when journalists presented the information and gave corroborating information to it, that was the truth. We no longer accept that today. So this effort was successful. They blocked the counting of the ballots. You had partisan supervisor of elections as Sandra Gord, supervisor of elections from Seminole County, a Republican county, actually allowed the Republican Executive Committee officials to come into her office and add numbers to the ID numbers of the voters to the ballots so that those ballots could in fact be counted. Wow. She was the only individual that I directly know that acted in a partisan manner, but I know that she did. And we know that because she later sued the individuals that sued her, claiming that she did something illegal. And what the judge did was turn around and gave attorneys cost. You have to pay the attorneys that sue you, madam. There's no remedy for me to pull out those absentee ballots that you improperly added to the total. But I'm not going to give you any redress against those attorneys that brought the case. You have to pay for their legal costs because they were right. There's just no remedy because once those illegal mail ballots were added to the total, you can't pull them out because voters' votes are secret in the state of Florida. So again, there was a whole range of issues, but it was in fact in my mind, a travesty that occurred, the greatest political travesty and tragedy. And when the Supreme Court voted to stop the count, that was, in my opinion, the night that democracy was betrayed by the Supreme Court of the United States of America. Justice Scalia's son was a campaign worker in the Bush campaign. Any other judge in the country would have had to recuse himself from the case because his son was a party to that case. He did not refuse, and he knew he did something wrong because it was Justice Scalia later who got angered when people were asking him about the 2000 election, and his only answer was the Italian, "Get over it.
Yeah.
Get over it." That's what he said. No respect for the question, no respect for why it was asked. But you know what? Shut your mouth and don't talk to me about that anymore. I don't want to hear it. That's essentially the Republicans' response to the legal issues of Bush v. Gore.
Well, Ion, isn't it funny that all these people that were involved in Florida in 2000 on the Bush campaign, they all got very big jobs in the Bush White House. Scalia's son, I think he worked for the Department of Labor, or he got a job in there. Catherine Harris runs for Congress and wins, and then she got demolished by Bill Nelson in 2006.
Well, what they did, they set her up. They set Catherine Harris up. Catherine Harris wanted to run for an open Senate seat, but the Republicans told her, because they didn't like her and she was considered a lightweight, you'll run for the next one. Let's give a Hispanic, Mel Martinez, this shot, and we'll all support you on the next go around. They did not support her on the next go around. They cut her legs under. They wanted nothing to do with her at all.
I didn't know that she was going to run in 2004, because I remember Martinez ran against Betty Casta. And I didn't know that it was supposed to be Harris in 4.
Oh, yeah.
I know she ran in 6, but yeah.
Right. She wanted to run in 2004, but you have to remember she was so incompetent that when she filed to run, she forgot that there is something called a resign to run law, which the Secretary of State administers. And when you file to run, you have to file an irrevocable letter saying that you're going to resign your position to run for that position. She, the individual that oversaw those laws, didn't know they exist apparently, and she was actually forced to resign from the Secretary of State because she failed to do the resign to run law letter required under Florida law. So the Republicans knew that she was a flake. She really wasn't very intelligent. She was basically a millionaire baby kisser. And I can tell you that because I, at a Supervisor of Elections conference, brought my 1-year-old son to that conference. And the very first thing she did when she met us at our reception was grab my 1-year-old baby and kiss it. It was like, give me back my child. I really don't want you to be touching my baby. So anyways, that woman basically was a political animal, but knew absolutely nothing about elections at all, which is why she screwed up her own resign to run law.
Well, and I want to get into Leon County and how you guys handle it, because you guys handled the 2000 election with the fewest errors in the whole election. My thing was, and just to, last thing on Catherine Harris was, you had a bunch of bubble brains running the Department of Elections with Clay Roberts, Catherine Harris, and then obviously Jeb was running the whole thing. So my thing is, if I'm the Gore campaign, you're already set up to pretty much lose, because Clay Roberts, and he also got a judgeship after this. He's still in a judgeship. So
everybody got paid off.
Yeah.
Everybody in Florida got paid off.
Right. It's crazy. So how did you guys in Leon County, and you as the Supervisor of Elections, have the fewest amount of errors in the 2000 election?
Well, you have to understand my own background. I was an aggrieved candidate in 1986. I ran for a local county position, and the Supervisor of Elections, who was a newly elected, negligently programmed the lever voting machines. Now, you may have never even seen a lever voting machine.
No.
They were invented by Thomas Edison in the 1880s. Okay. Lever voting machines or mechanical voting machines were designed to get rid of paper ballot fraud, which was legion. People were stuffing ballot boxes. As a historian of voting, you don't want me to get you into the stories of how paper ballot boxes were stuffed. So they invented this machine called a lever voting machine that was to eliminate all of those stuffing of the ballots, except that actually in Chicago, they determined how to manipulate those as well. Yanni, here's the thing. No voting system is perfect if you have characters who are nefarious and want to commit fraud. And that's the true issue. That's why you have to build an apparatus around your voting machine system with nonpartisan professional elections administration. And the huge lesson that we didn't learn, Rob, in the 2000 election was we went down the rabbit hole of technology. The people in Palm Beach holding those ballots up to the fluorescent lights to see if they were punched. The entire media got focused on the technology. And so the aftermath of the 2000 election went down the wrong reform road. Although we did need to reform the technology, what we needed to reform was making sure that our elections administration was insulated from partisan actors like Catherine Harris, the Secretary of State, who was the co-manager of the George Bush campaign for president in Florida, the Secretary of State, who's charged with overseeing the fair counting, is actually in the state of Florida, one of the chief partisans to ensure that their candidate wins. We did not make the necessary reforms to recognize that the real problem was the interference of partisan people injecting themselves for a particular reason to gain the outcome they needed. Instead, we looked at it strictly as, oh, it was a mechanical issue and we got to get rid of punch card ballots and we have to have machines that are verifiable. But in the aftermath of the election that passed, in the Help America Vote Act that was passed in 2002, it was filled with loopholes, didn't address the major issues. For example, you had a situation in which legislation in that massive bill said that all voting machines have to be auditable. You have to be able to audit them. Mm-hmm. And the League of Women Voters, who fought strenuously and they thought successfully to include that language in the new bill, failed to recognize that the new bill didn't say that any of the elections had to be audited. So while the states bought machines that were auditable, they never audited the elections. And then when the League of Women Voters in different states sued them, they lost that suit, because where in the statute does it say that these auditable voting machines have to be audited? Mm-hmm. So this battle of auditing the election continues all the way until today. And I will tell you that what I learned in the 2000 election was you have, as an election administrator, a responsibility to transparently verify all the elections. So we switched to optical scan balloting in 1992. I was a leader in that. In nationwide, Leon County was the second state in the country to adopt a voting system that was developed by a global election company, which was an analog optical scan reader. So when the 2000 election came along, I was able to show the world every ballot and every vote cast for every candidate and those that were empty. Actually, out of almost 150,000 votes that were cast, we had like 50 individuals, maybe 53, who chose not to vote in that race. That was all. Mm-hmm. So we had a tremendous, I will tell you that we were the accurate 0.18%, less than 1/5 of 1% was our residual vote rate. That might have been the best residual vote rate in the United States of America. Yeah. Because of that, the Florida Supreme Court appointed me as the designee to be the technical overseer of the election. They knew of my reputation. I'd been recognized as a creative supervisor of elections. And again, it was because I lost a contested race. So when I came in, I was going to change the technology. I was going to put my personal reputation on the line to verify those votes. And we did a good job because we had the right technology, and we could actually show everyone every ballot, every mark. And unfortunately, there was technology that couldn't do that. Central count technology that was used by a company called AIS, who, by the way, disappears after the 2000 election. The Sequoia ballots that were punch card ballots, which actually may have been rigged, that company goes out of business in the next decade. And so there's a whole lot of very smelly things here, but the issue that I go to is the fact that partisans prevented the state of Florida from examining and counting all their votes. And that kind of process of win at any cost, irrespective of what it does to our political history, that becomes the dominant theme now for the Republican Party that eventually leads to Donald Trump.
So I only voted myself personally. I'm 32 years old on optical scan. My first election was the primaries in 2008. And I was voting in Boca Raton because I went to Lynn University down there. And so I've only been used to optical scan. Why is there not? Because we still see issues in Palm Beach County, in Broward, in Miami-Dade. We saw them in 2018 with the governor's race, with Andrew Gillum, and also with the U.S. Senate race with Bill Nelson, and both ended up losing. I have my takes on why that happened, but we won't get into that. But why is there not that statewide ballot for optical scan? Because it seems like it works like a charm compared to all these other silly systems, whether it's computers or these other, push ballots, punch card ballots. It's silliness.
Because our technology is really run by private vendors.
Okay.
Private vendors, whether it's EIS, Dominion, Vote Right, other companies that sell. We have a public process, which is elections. It's controlled by the companies that manufacture private proprietary voting equipment. In 2005, when I became the first election official to conduct an independent voting test on the voting machine, that almost cost me my job, because the voting machine vendors absolutely did not want election officials like myself, who actually, my county bought that equipment. Leon County owned that equipment. They didn't want Leon County to lift up the hood and see what was inside, what was running it, the software, how was it being. We found out that the voting machine companies were not accurate. They did not know their own vulnerabilities within their own system. We were told, for example, that my own system, which was an optical scan, would record every event. Anybody that touched that machine would be recorded in a log, so that anybody that tampered, it would be evident. But later on, we found out that this was built on an ancient Microsoft database. And so you could actually bypass the entire logs by simply going through notes. You could use Microsoft Notes and go right around every barrier, because if you knew Microsoft, you could go right around every barrier that was set up in this device. And that device was the device used in Ohio in 2004, which produced interesting results. Anyway, so not wanting to go into 2004, going back to 2000, it was a major battle. And I will tell you that during the last week after I was appointed the technical advisor, MSNBC wired me. Every step I did for 5 days was recorded, because we were all waiting for the Supreme Court decision to come down and render whether or not we can actually do the recount, or whether the recount would be blocked. And if the recount would continue, I would have the major role in overseeing that recount. And of course, late on that Thursday night, we got the word that the Supreme Court would not let Florida continue to count the ballots per its own statutes, and everything was over. Everything was over. But I will tell you, it hurt worse when I discovered what the real fraud was. It turns out that in March of 2001, because Florida has a very, very broad public records request, emails from the general counsel of Katherine Harris's elections office reveal that, in fact, there had been a successful plot to remove thousands of African Americans as voters during the 2000 election. And this was not revealed until after the election. It seems that in March of 2000, the Secretary of State's office, under the authority of the General Counsel, sent out lists of voters that were felons and needed to be removed from the voting rolls. Well, Leon County had some inkling that this might have inaccuracies, because such a list was sent out in 1998, right in the August primary. And when we sent that list out, we received hundreds of angry responses from voters who said, excuse me, I'm not a felon. I haven't lost my right to vote. I received these from lawyers who, of course, aren't convicted of felons, or they can't practice law. So at that point, the head of the elections department basically said, don't use the list, stop using the list. And so we never did. But they never made, and the election officials appointed me and another official to go and talk to the Division of Elections and see if we can get an accurate list, because we did not want lists that would wrongly identify legal voters as people who are not eligible to vote. So we were told after a series of meetings that this was correct, that the Division of Elections had corrected this and the lists were accurate. After the election, I found the emails from the people who had been in that meeting, where the vendor had told the general counsel, Bucky Mitchells, that we can do what the Supervisor of Elections want and give you a list that's 90% accurate. And what the response was from Bucky Mitchell was loosen the standards and make it 70% accurate. This meant that if your name was, for example, and I'll use a very common one, if your name was Richard Johnson, 70% of those letters would match up to Richard Johnston. Yeah. You would be identified as Richard Johnston as the felon, even though you actually didn't have the same spelling as the felon. If 70% of the letters matched, you were identified as the felon. And across the state, in November of 2000, when these legal voters went to vote, they were told in counties like Jacksonville and Duval County, you're a former felon, it is illegal for you to vote, get out of here, or we will call the police and have you arrested. Thousands of African Americans around the state, legal voters who had been voting for their entire life, Rob, were turned away from the polls. This was not discovered during the aftermath of looking at those cards in the fluorescent lights. We did not discover this until really March after the election, when the emails traffic confirmed that the Division of Elections under Bucky Mitchell's direction put out these lists that were terribly flawed. And I will tell you how terribly flawed they were. Leon County received such a list with 693 people on it. Mm-hmm. We went through that list. I assigned my tech staff to go through it to verify who was a felon. We were able to verify 37 felons out of a list of almost 700 people. Mm-hmm. We removed those 34 people, and all the other ones, except for one, we allowed to vote. And one individual on election day, Wayne Williams, a minister had been identified. And he called our office. We did a quick check, and we then allowed him to vote. But as far as I can tell, nowhere around the state were these lists as scrutinized as Leon County. And in a suit brought after the election, the Division of Elections verified that they were able to determine at least 12,000 African Americans were illegally barred from the election in 2000. Remember, this was an election that was ultimately decided by 537 votes. And the Secretary of State admits that 12,000 African Americans that they were identified. I think the number goes to 18,000. But it's irrelevant because we know, for example, that 96% of all the African American votes in the state of Florida cast in the election went to Gore. Right. So just a fraction of these 12,000 to 18,000 voters would have actually swung the election to Gore, right, making the news media's predictions correct. The news media's polls correctly indicated who the winner was going to be, but the massive disenfranchisement by African Americans who were illegally identified as felons and prevented from voting in the 2000 election, that spelled the difference. That spelled the difference in this. And also another thing that was not discovered was that a majority of the canvassing boards, the local election boards, which verify the votes, they made a huge mistake. Because this was the first time there was a statewide recount like this, many election officials did not even know how to properly define the word overvote. As I mentioned earlier in this program, an overvote is when you illegally cast more votes in a race that is legally allowed. So it's a vote for one candidate, for example, and you vote for two candidates. That ballot can't be counted because who gets the vote? That is thrown out. What Florida and what we discovered in the aftermath of the election, and this was discovered by David Damron of the Orlando Sentinel, an investigative reporter, was that in fact, thousands of voters on their paper ballot saw a list of 10 candidates, and at the bottom was the line write-in candidate. Well, thousands of Floridians wrote in the name of, voted for Bush, filled in the bubble, and down in the bottom, voted for George Bush, because they thought it meant, okay, you pick the guy, but now you have to write the name out, write-in candidate. There were thousands of these overvotes across the state, thousands. But because we never counted the overvotes, they were never discovered. It was only the media consortium who then looked at all 67 counties' votes and did the recount, was this discovered. That in fact, and what happened was that 31 counties in the state of Florida, including Leon County, properly saw that that was an overvote. And so that ballot meant under Florida law, you had to duplicate that ballot and remove the oval in the write-in candidate, and you duplicate it and you provide a true and accurate ballot of the individual's vote so that it can be run through the scanner. All votes to be legally counted have to be cast on machine in Florida. So when you have a situation like an overvote where someone writes in, votes for Gore and writes in Gore, that ballot, which can't be read by the machine, has to be duplicated. A serial number is put on it so it can be traced back to the original ballot. And then essentially you make a ballot that can be read with a machine. 31 counties did that properly. 36 counties looked at those ballots and said, aha, 2 votes in a race in which only 1 vote was cast. We're throwing them all out. Excuse me, they only voted for 1 candidate. They voted for 1 candidate. 36 counties improperly threw out those votes. And as the media consortium counted, if all of the votes were counted properly under Florida law, the undervotes and the overvotes, that generates a Gore victory of 171 votes for the 2000 election. So this boggles the mind. This hurt my mind dramatically when I found out this information. And it converted me from a run-of-the-mill kind of election official now into an advocate for voting rights, because I now have witnessed and know that, in fact, that election was stolen. And it was stolen by partisans who ejected themselves into the process. And what we really need in 2020, as we need in 2000, was laws preventing the injection of partisan actors in the process to bias the vote counting. And we're seeing that, unfortunately, all across the country: Georgia, Florida, Arizona. Anywhere there's a Republican-dominated legislature, they're altering the rules to make it harder for citizens to vote, allowed by now a packed United States Supreme Court, which, because it had those individuals that were appointed by Bush and swung the court to the conservative side, they have now destroyed the Voting Rights Act, which is the single greatest piece of legislation designed to ensure that we could have liberty and justice for all in the voting arena. And until the Voting Rights Act or some similar act is passed, we are in dire straits in America, because now the partisans know they can put their hand on the scale legislatively and restrict citizens' access to the ballot. And that's where we are today in the United States of America.
For people that are listening, again, this is Voltaire Sancho. He was, for 28 years, from 89 until 2017, the Leon County Supervisor of Elections in Florida. And I just want to recap this, and before we go into the next question. So you just did, when you were speaking, I should say, you just spoke about DBT, so database technologies. That's the company that was paid by Harris and Clay Roberts, and they signed off on that $4 million list that came back 95% wrong. And as you stated, all these African-American voters were banned to vote. So I just wanted to give that little bit of background information on what you just stated. I was also told that police were blocking polling places during that election. They were harassing Black voters in general. Up in even near your neck of the woods, I heard they were doing that stuff too. So I do want to move. Go ahead.
Yes, the Florida Highway Patrol set up traffic checks nearby very heavily populated African-American precincts in South Leon County without telling us, without letting us know. So there was all sorts of, and again, the Florida Highway Patrol is controlled by the governor's office. And who was the governor? It was Jeb Bush, the brother of the candidate who ran. And again, this really highlights the fact that the real problem here is that we have today, I will tell you that, good technology, not the best, but we need to verify every election by auditing. You see, Leon County led the way in 2008 in an automated auditing system that now we have by a company called Clear Ballot out of Massachusetts, a wholly owned employee company. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I learned after the 2000 election was I needed to audit in a transparent manner and show to the citizens of my jurisdiction the validity and veracity of every vote counted in every election. That technology exists. And there are other auditing technologies such as risk limiting audits, which can be done. But irrespective of which direction and whether we use technology or manual methods, every election in this country should be audited before it's certified. And that is not the rule in most jurisdictions. Even Florida's certification occurs 9 days before Florida's audit, which means that if our audit indicates that there was a voting machine mistake, it cannot be changed in the official turn numbers. Can't be changed. And that is insane. If you find that there is a mistake, and I will tell you, the greatest problem facing voters is not fraud by voters, It's simple mistakes by the individuals who are the technicians and machines. We can see that, for example, in Michigan, for example, where there was much controversy over a particular town in which the numbers indicated that Biden defeated Trump, the election official, Antrim, Michigan. The election official immediately recognized the problem and recognized that she had failed to update her software on her voting machines, and that an accurate count was available within 24 hours, but it was too late. The lies that voting machines were flipping votes was already going through the Republican blogosphere, reinforcing Trump's lies that the election had been stolen. So again, mistakes made by human beings are part of this process. And that's why good election officials have procedures to verify and audit the vote. But Trump took advantage of Americans' ignorance about elections, because most elections, the numbers are wide enough that the calls are made on Tuesday, election night. This election was too close, so you had to count all the ballots. Well, again, the vote by mail ballots in states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Minnesota and Pennsylvania, those laws prohibited the election officials from counting the ballots until election day. Well, it means that the thousands of ballots that they're going to be counted has to be added to the totals at some later date, which Trump had told all of his people, these are all going to be illegal votes. Look, they're going to be adding votes to election night. Excuse me? They're always added because you have to count all the ballots, and they always take a certain period of time. California example allows 28 days for the official totals to be delivered to Sacramento. Florida is one of the shortest. We have 12 days, but in Arizona, 20 some days. So every state does it different. And the fact is, the Republican Party took advantage of America's ignorance over its own election system to cry foul, and it was a lie. And now we have to deal with that in our American electoral process.
So we interviewed Carol Roberts about right before the pandemic, I should say, about this same issue. She was on that canvassing board for Palm Beach County, then ran for Congress afterwards. But besides that point, if you were in Palm Beach County, we know the election supervisor was Teresa Lepore. She was a Democrat. And the Democrats, as well as the Republicans, agreed to that ballot. But if you were the election supervisor back in 2000, what would you have done with the ballot, even the recount? Even going back to the recount, they took days off before Thanksgiving instead of finishing the counting of the votes. So they weren't finished at that time. Where Broward and I believe Miami-Dade, I think they shut theirs down, but I know Broward got theirs done. But Palm Beach could have if they didn't shut down. So what would you have done with the ballot and the recount if you were the supervisor in Palm Beach County?
Well, of course, they used a punch card ballot, and Teresa Lepore made the decision to use a unique method because she was using an archaic punch card system that was manufactured, I believe, in 1972, some 28 years before the election. It was technology that was obsolete, should never be used for voting, but the county commission never wanted to give monies to the supervisor of elections to upgrade the system. And this has been part of the problem that even occurs now. The state funds nothing in elections. Nothing.
Oh, wow.
Nothing. Only the counties. It comes right out of the county taxpayers. So if you want to buy new voting machines, the county pays for it, not the state, not one penny for the state. So a lot of these counties in Florida were using these old punch card systems that were not much better than the lever voting machines that we were using in Leon County in the early 90s. And we transited from that. So these punch card systems were really two technologies old. All of the technology of the punch card systems had been surpassed by the scanners. But Palm Beach and Broward and Dade, their county commissioners wouldn't give them the money to upgrade to an accurate system. Whereas I was lucky in that I came to office because an election official botched the election. So they gave me the money to fix the mistake. And that's how I bought all of the optical scanners to have an actual verifiable system that we could show to the citizens what the votes were accurately. So this problem of funding actually manifested itself in 2020, where when the Republicans refused to provide additional monies to election officials all over the country for PPP, for those plastic barriers to make voting safe, these monies were not made available. The SAFE Act was blocked up by the Republicans in the US Senate. So private individuals like Schwarzenegger from California, the Zuckerberg family, they made available millions of dollars to private funds that election officials could use to buy the PPP, to buy the additional equipment, to hire the additional staff necessary to deal with, quite frankly, the largest election in 102 years. Carol Roberts played a unique role in this, and she was eventually convicted of illegal activities in Palm Beach County because what she ended up was a pass-through for a fellow by the name of Stone.
Oh, Roger
you might
Stone,
remember.
yeah.
Roger Stone, I believe.
Right.
And you had briefly talked about Miami-Dade didn't do a recount because there was something called
the Brooks Brothers
riot,
right.
in which Roger Stone was in a travel trailer outside the 8-story municipal building. The elections office is in the 8th. Radio Mambi is broadcasting live, telling its Hispanic customers that the recount actually is marking ballots and they're going to steal the election the same way Castro stole the elections in Cuba. That was being broadcast per Radio Mambi and Roger Stone. And so these Republican staffers who later on, looking at the financial reports, were flown down from Washington, D.C. by Halliburton and other corporations, actually stormed the Miami Election Center 8th floor, wearing the famous Brooks Brothers suits and ties. Individuals who later go on to be major players in the Republican Party were there. The pictures show it. These individuals actually shut down the Miami-Dade recount, attacked Representative Joe Geller, who at that time was a county commissioner, knocked him to the floor, put the entire Miami-Dade canvassing board in fear of their lives, and they canceled the recount. And I know this history because those ballots were sent to Leon County, stored in a new room that was built adjacent to my Supervisor of Elections office on the 3rd floor of the Leon County Courthouse, guarded by 4 FDLE soldiers carrying submachine guns who took over my conference room. I had an employee have a nervous breakdown over that. You don't normally have submachine gun, black uniformed individuals in an elections office. The trauma was insane. The pressure was incredible. Lawyers, lawsuits, constant pressure. The effort was to block everything, not to have anything work, just shut her down, because the fear was, and now we know it was an accurate fear, if a complete accurate counting of those ballots would be done, that in fact the Republican candidate would lose. So that election was shut down as hard and fast as it could be. And the law was what was trampled on in Florida. Florida was not able to follow its law. Florida had good laws if we could have followed them and if we could have properly interpreted them. Now I'm referring to the 36 counties who improperly defined an overvote. If we had done this process right, America's history would be changed forever.
So with Palm Beach County, and obviously all this happened, I know we had a Republican governor and, Catherine Harris, Clay Roberts, all those people were running operations over there for the Bush campaign. But if it was an impartial group up there in Tallahassee, what do you think should have happened? Should they have done a recount? All these black voters, 18,000, 22,000, whatever it may be, were not able to vote because they were on these lists, and most of them shouldn't have been on the list, rather. How should we have conducted this 2000 election? Should it have been the hand recount? Should it have been a revote fully? Because in Palm Beach County, all these Jewish voters who were not going to vote. I went to school down there. I know a lot of these people. They were not voting for Pat Buchanan, an anti-Semite. They were going to vote for Al Gore and Joe Lieberman, who was Jewish. I mean, it's common sense. So
well,
what
you're
would
right.
you have done?
Well, there's nothing, unfortunately, in Florida law or that allows for a revote. And those over 5,000 Jewish individuals who voted for the anti-Semite Pat Buchanan, there's nothing that could be done for their vote, because that vote, that Teresa Lepore, and there is no recall of constitutional officers. So the citizens of Palm Beach County were left to do only one thing. They removed Teresa Lepore. That was the only response that could have been applied, unfortunately, to Palm Beach County and their voters. Once those votes have been recorded and intermingled, to separate them out. Of course, Florida law changed so that technology could never be used again in any election. But I will tell you that what should have been done was that the election officials in the Division of Elections should have stood up and said, we must follow our rules. Our rules are, in fact, proper. In fact, we were attacked, for example, using those punch card ballots, and we were attacked in court saying, you're using an illegal method to count those ballots. Well, as an election official who's cognizant of the rules around the country, I can tell you the recount rules for punch card ballots were identical to the recount rules for punch card ballots for the state of Texas. They were identical. And yet there was no lawsuit shutting down the state of Texas's count. None at all. There was a lawsuit filed to shut down Florida's count for the only reason that if they allowed the recount to continue, they were afraid Bush would have lost. So again, the effort was to shut down the recount. And in no other state in the country has that occurred. The recount is a usual, normal process. But again, because Americans didn't really know much about election laws, they were playable by the fear of the Republicans that they're not just recounting the ballots, they're manufacturing ballots, they're cheating. And again, this idea of the Democrats stealing the elections is one that now continues all the way through and culminates in Trump's lies in 2020.
But Ion, wasn't it a mistake by the Gore campaign to not do a full state recount instead of just coming out and saying, like they did, oh, we're only going to recount in Volusia, Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami-Dade?
Well, let me explain to you. I do have a law degree, and again, election law is very complex. But
Okay.
In fact, this is the only way that you could get to a statewide recount under Florida law, under Chapter 102. Florida's laws had no recount provisions up until the 1980s. Until 1986, there were no state recount laws at all. And they wrote the recount laws in 1986, only cognizant of what the technology they knew was available then. So recounts, since there had been no recounts in the history of the state of Florida, the legislators were cautious about setting up a recount law. And what you are unaware is that in order to get a statewide recount, Florida law required you to pick single counties to determine whether or not you could find discoverable errors. And if you could find discoverable errors in those counties, that would allow you to then go to a statewide recount. And the Republican Party, knowing that people didn't know the law, when the Gore campaign followed Florida law and identified Volusia and the other counties that you had mentioned, they were merely following the law. The law required them to cherry pick specific counties to see if there were identifiable errors. And only upon finding those identifiable errors could you then invoke a statewide recount. So the Republicans did a beautiful ploy here. They took advantage of the citizens' ignorance of Florida law, because right off the bat, it's a logical question. Well, why not have a statewide recount? Because Florida law didn't allow for a statewide recount. So what the Republicans beautifully did was take the Democratic effort to follow the law and trap them into, aha, you're cherry picking, without telling the citizens, the law requires this. The law required this cherry picking, so to speak. And
they were just saying that, right. They were just saying that Al Gore wants to just count Democratic votes. He doesn't.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Right. It was a brilliant ploy, and the media, being completely ignorant, just ran with it. They just ran with it. Right. Because basically they didn't know election law either. I can count on two hands the amount of journalists who are aware of election laws nationally, because journalists have to be generalists. And I will tell you that they did not know they were being played, unfortunately. The only one who did were election officials, and we don't really have voice. We were kind of shunned aside in the entire process. And the battle took place in front of courtrooms, in front of judges, many of whom were biased. Right. And unfortunately, tactical legal issues were done. It was a mistake, for example, to bring in the Microsoft lawyer, Du Bois. It was a mistake to bring him. He didn't know Florida election law. But
I was told that a lot of lawyers in Florida wouldn't even go on the Gore team because Jeb, obviously being the governor and all the clout he had, it was his brother. And if they went and worked for Gore, they would be seen as like the Antichrist in the state of Florida until Jeb left office.
Yes, it's true. But now you're using information that we garnered after the election.
Oh,
again,
okay.
public record laws were able to then grab the logs of Jeb Bush. So I'm saying after the election, we discern exactly what you're saying, that in fact, Jeb Bush's legal team started calling up on the day after the election, every major law firm, and basically warning them, you take this case, you're done in Florida. You're done. And that really did intimidate many of the attorneys. In fact, the Mark Herron, who was an attorney that he was fired from his law firm for taking the case. People do not realize the pure, brute political pressure that went on behind the scenes. Again, shut down the recount. The pressure on the lawyers did not become recognized until journalists were able to get the telephone logs from Jeb Bush's office. And then they found out, my God, these people are calling all the attorneys in the state. They're shutting down the recount from a legal point of view by basically saying, you touch this, you're dead to us in the state of Florida. And that had a significant impact, even causing Mark Herron to lose his position. And positions that Mark Herron took were twisted. For example, I remember hearing, oh, they're trying to prevent the military from voting. Oh, they're trying. What Mark Herron did was file a letter to the court saying, we would like to apply all of Florida's election laws to the process. And Florida election law required that you have a postmark on a ballot or it could not be counted. That was the law. That had been the law forever. And some of these ballots that didn't have postmarks were military ballots. So they shouldn't have been counted, except Republicans went into court and said the Democrats are trying to stop the troops. Oh, we got to let the troops. Oh, excuse me. What about following the law?
Right.
What about following the law? But the law was irrelevant to this battle. It became a huge PR mess. And the Democrats were, quite frankly, you have to understand the Democrats are institutional. They're policy wonks. They are actually, Gore did the honorable thing. You know, Gore did the honorable thing. He is not going to challenge the validity of the election, even though there was a slim possibility that he could prevail, because the honorable thing was not to do that to America. And I will tell you, it might have been the last honorable act that a national politician ever committed. And Democrats were mad at him for doing this. You should continue, fight. And I know people today that are still won't forgive Gore for doing that. But you have to understand that he grew up under a different age in which really politicians were gentlemen. You told each other the truth. At the end of the day, you didn't go to your separate political bailiwicks and continue to war. You met over at the at Ebbitt's Grill and had dinner with the other Republicans. I mean, it was a collegial body until 2000. And our politics have been inexorably broken after the 2000 election.
Right. I agree with you 100%. I don't think there's much after the Supreme Court decision that, Gore rather could have done. You know, there wasn't much, if anything, that he could have done. So
there wasn't. I agree.
So that was it. We can both agree that it was a stolen election 100%, but there's not much that the man could have done. I got to respect him for the speech that he made and the fight. Although I'll tell you what, the Republicans, and I am not a Republican, but I will give them one thing. They know how to lie, cheat, and steal, and they know how to steal everything they can do. And the Democrats can't play that game. The Republicans have them. It's like a no contest. And, that's not what America's about. But you know what? They play to win, and they play dirty, and the Democrats just can't keep up with that. It's 100% true.
Again, you have the Democrats are kind of like the party of institutional government, traditional government. And that's not where the Republican Party has been for a long time, since the 2000 election.
Right. So let's go into this with the last three questions, Ion. I really appreciate your time on this. But we talked about Supervisor of Election Harris and how much pull she had over on this election. And we didn't really bring up Mac's name, but obviously he was running the show. He was kind of the puppet master behind the curtain. But, going into this, so it was an elected position. Now it's appointed by the governor. Do you think that we need some system here in the state of Florida where it should be an independent position? Maybe that's being, it's agreed on by both Democrats and Republicans to kind of have, somebody like you that's very non-partial, that, plays it in the middle, even Steven.
Well, I will tell you that I opposed giving the division of elections over to the partisan political appointee of the governor. I opposed that. But again, since 1998, the state of Florida has been completely controlled by the Republicans, both houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and the governor's office. So essentially, why should they play it fair? And that's their attitude. So I did recommend that we go to a nonpartisan state election board situation in which we had members of all major parties and minor parties represented on an independent election board. That went nowhere when the Florida legislature was considering what to do with the Secretary of State Division of Elections. And I will tell you that even where there were fair boards established, since then nationally, the Republicans have tried to deconstruct them. Wisconsin is an example of this. They had a governmental accountability board. Their elections were certified by judges, former judges certified Wisconsin's elections. And when Scott Walker, a very, very partisan Republican, took over, they gutted that because the first thing they wanted to do was get rid of nonpartisan fair elections that they couldn't influence. So what we're seeing right now is that same partisan influence all over, not only Wisconsin. Florida is a prime example, and Florida has been a generator of many of the voter suppression techniques, which have been exported to the other Republican states. We're not only we're a leader, unfortunately, in exporting voter suppression techniques. For example, what we just witnessed in Texas, where over 10,000 legal Texas voters had their votes tossed when they voted by mail because of new requirements that were added to their law this year. Where do you think Texas got those ideas about requiring additional information? It was from Florida. In our earlier legislation, which is being sued, by the way, in federal district court as you and I speak. But again, Florida has been generating these kinds of voter suppression techniques and sending them to the other states. Georgia, for example, last year passed a new law that allowed their county commissioners to appoint the election official, taking it away from the nonpartisan elections office. And so you have situations like Vanessa Waddell, who had been working in Rome, Georgia, doing elections for years. They took the authority to conduct the elections away from her, a Black Democrat, and gave it to a Republican who had never run elections before and believed in the 2020 conspiracy of Bush. Now that individual is going to be counting the votes instead of a nonpartisan bureaucrat whose job it was historically to count the votes accurately. So we have a bad history here in Florida. We are the generator of much of the voter suppression that's being exported and we see in the rest of this country. And what can we do about it? We're caught because the Florida legislature is dominated by Republicans. You have no career if you're a Republican, or a Democrat, and even Republicans who object to the leadership position. A Republican, Jeff Brandes, opposed the leadership election bill. He was stripped of his chairmanship. They do not brook dissent. You as a Republican cannot voice any dissent over the leadership. So what we have in Florida is authoritarian rule, not democratic rule. And that's why they've been able to do these things such as manipulate the elections, put a heavy hand on, and it just really, it's sickening because the partisan control over elections should be removed. I can tell you that good elections policy is sacrificed to partisan politics day in and day out around this country. One of the very first things I did, for example, in politics was I worked on amending Florida's law in 1980 to allow people to request vote by mail ballots over the telephone. That was asked of me to write that amendment and was submitted by a Democratic African-American legislator at the time. Well, because a Democrat introduced that, the Republicans voted unanimously against it. Yet within 4 years, after the 2000 election, when they saw that more votes being cast by Republicans by mail, they changed the laws to allow that. Yeah. If they perceive that they can gain an advantage by changing the laws, they do that. And if anything that the opposition party pushes, they're going to be against it because they figure that the opposition party is pushing it because they're going to gain an advantage. So that kind of political control over the elections is going on in a majority of the states in the United States of America, and that's what has to end. If Americans want safe and accurate elections, you've got to get the elections out of the hands of partisans already shown they will do and say anything to win. That's their only value.
Ian, let's end with this last question. as far as this goes, we've talked pretty in depth about the 2000 election. With the end of the interview coming up here, what do you hope people learn from this election and also from our interview today?
Well, I hope they learn that our elections need protection from partisan interference.
Yeah.
For the majority of my career, I had no party affiliation. And I chose that party affiliation, which banned me from voting in Florida's parties,
Right.
because election officials need to be like judges, the honest ones. I'm going to be working with major parties, both major parties. I'm going to be working with minor parties. I may not interfere in that process to make sure that anyone that wants to be able to vote can have that vote and have it counted as they intended. And with partisan interference raising its ugly head in the American election process today, that is, to me, the number one threat. I can tell you that I've had a lot of problems with election officials over the course of my career. I was considered a black sheep. I would attack election officials, but election officials as a group, I can tell you, are the most patriotic public officials I have ever met in my life. They bleed red, white, and blue. And for what we have done with them following the 2020 election is a travesty and a sham. And if we don't correct that, we are going to lose democracy. Because as our founders wrote in our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, a just government depends upon the will of the governed. The will of the governed is made manifest in our system by the ballot. If we deny the governed the access to the ballot, we can never have what our founders recognized was a just government. And the people who are today saying that we're going in the wrong direction, underlying that is the fact that we do not allow the will of the governed to be made manifest through elections in America.
Voltaire Sancho, he was the supervisor of elections for 28 years from 1989 to 2017 in Leon County. Again, for people that don't know the geographic area of Florida, that is over in the Tallahassee region of the state. And also, Leon, you are a national treasure. We need to have people like you all over the media, all over the news, because you're telling people really what is going on in American elections, and the lies that they're hearing pushed, whether it's on the mainstream news or it's on the internet, is despicable. And we need somebody like you to get on there and hopefully give the truth out. I hope people bring more people like you on as far as that goes.
Well, thank you very much for your kind words. To me, I am an individual who loves American elections. Yeah. I now find American politics is very despicable. There's no honor in our politics. And I was raised in an era in which honor was important in American politics. Today, the honorable people are leaving or defeated. And what we see are people who would do anything and say anything for power. And those are the last people we should be electing to public office.
Lastly, I'll say they'll do anything for power and money, and we need to get money out of elections. It should be, it's gotten out of control since Citizens United. It's really been a detriment on society. And that's why we see, these people that are, regular working class, good people try to run for office, and they just can't compete with these big money people that are sold out to the fossil fuel industry, to the big pharma, and the list goes on and on. It's really despicable and terrible, but that's where our country is, came to, unfortunately. But Ian, thanks so much. I'm looking forward to our next conversation doing this, and I really am happy we got to talk today. Thanks so much.
My pleasure, Rob.